This new plan is facing immediate rejection, and the opposition isn't just coming from Ukraine and Europe. Putin himself is dismissing the arrangement. The ultimate irony is that Russia's own propagandist, Kirill Dimitrov, crafted the entire plan, a document that essentially grants Russia all its demands. Despite receiving everything requested, Putin is now leveraging the proposal purely as a negotiating tactic to secure further concessions, with the explicit goal of dragging out the war. This reveals Russia's core objective. The entire plan is designed to delay sanctions and actively harm Ukraine's defensive capabilities. The most significant aspect of this strategy involves the $300 billion in frozen Russian funds. This money was on the verge of being transferred to Ukraine, but is now deliberately stuck in legal uncertainty, exactly what Putin desired. Putin views this uncertainty as an opening to keep pressing for greater advantages. This negotiating strategy is built entirely on deceit, a tactic the Russians have employed from the very beginning. The historical context of Russian negotiating tactics. Russians will continue pushing for more concessions as long as they are allowed to push us around. This echoes observations made decades ago by former President Nixon. Nixon recounted a pivotal interchange with Soviet leader Brezhnev concerning the placement of the EBM system. Brezhnev attempted to subtly mislead Nixon, claiming the agreed distance was 1,200 miles from Moscow. Nixon, thanks to excellent preparation from Henry Kissinger and his own briefing, countered firmly, "No, that's not correct. What I understand we've agreed to is 1,500 miles." Brezhnev immediately accepted the 1,500-mile requirement and dropped the matter. Kissinger later noted that this single interaction justified the entire summit. Nixon realized the Soviets were simply testing his resolve, trying to gauge how desperately he wanted a deal. When they found that Nixon maintained the same hard line as Kissinger, they conceded. Nixon summarized this tactic by referencing Lenin, who advised probing with bayonets. Lenin said, "If you find mush, proceed. If you find steel, withdraw." In this case, they encountered steel, and they withdrew. Anonymous Russian demands and the call for more concessions. While the 28-point plan contained some points that were beneficial for Ukraine, sources within the Kremlin and the Russian Foreign Ministry now report that Russians feel those points need further discussion. The sources indicate that while Trump is eager to conclude the deal, Putin is not. The Russians are claiming the plan is incomplete because they still need to negotiate critical items, such as 1. Ukrainian security guarantees, 2. The size of the Ukrainian military, 3. The issues of sanctions, 4. The $300 billion in frozen Russian assets. Essentially, Russians are anonymously expressing disagreement with every provision that might benefit Ukraine. Their tactic is transparent. Even if Ukraine were to accept the entire 28-point plan, which is not recommended, Russia will still protract the process and demand even more concessions. Putin's public confirmation of delay. Putin himself alluded to this strategy in his most recent public address, since the plan was made public. He confirmed that Trump's peace plan was discussed before their Alaska meeting. During those initial discussions, the U.S. side requested Russia to show flexibility and make certain concessions. Putin claims that during the Anchorage talks, they confirmed their agreement and readiness to show the requested flexibility, despite certain issues and complications on Russia's part. Russia communicated this stance to all its partners in the global south, including China, India, DPRK, South Africa, and Brazil, and CSTTO countries, and every single one supported the agreements. However, Putin claims the United States subsequently paused its efforts, which he believes was caused by Ukraine's outright refusal of the original Trump peace settlement plan. This led to the creation of the new 28-point iteration. Putin confirmed receiving this new plan and suggested it may serve as foundation for final peace settlement. He added that he views it as a good starting point for the final solution. This wording indicates that Russia does not intend to accept the plan as drafted, but rather to use it to initiate further bargaining, retracting commitments and seeking time. This refusal to commit mirrors Putin's behavior after the first Alaska meeting. At that time, Putin informed the US that he accepted the presence of foreign troops in Ukraine and was open to meeting Zelensky to work out a ceasefire. However, upon leaving Alaska, he retracted all those promises. For Putin, the true goal was never peace. It was merely to buy more time for the Russian economy. He wants to delay sanctions and external pressure that could potentially cause his war effort to collapse. Russian state media confirms this stance. Izvestia reports that Putin is signaling to Washington that he has no intention of sitting down with President Zelensky to sign a peace deal, despite earlier urging from Donald Trump. Putin also reiterated his long-standing efforts to delegitimize Ukraine's political leadership, describing them as an organized criminal group, repeating this point on the very day Kyiv confirmed receipt of the draft peace plan. Furthermore, Moskovsky Komolets confirmed that after the August Trump-Putin summit in Alaska, Russia exhibited no goodwill gestures, but instead showed just an intensification of attacks. Even though this 28-point plan was developed during a meeting between Steve Witkoff and Kirill Dmitry, Putin's secondary man and propagandist, Putin is now declaring that this is not the final draft. The critical flaw: weaponizing the $300 billion. Some online argue that if both Ukrainians and Russians are unhappy with the plan, perhaps it's a good starting point, as compromise requires both sides to yield something. The major flaw in this thinking is that this plan is actively debilitating Ukraine's ability to defend itself. The most damaging element relates to the $300 billion in frozen Russian funds. Background on frozen assets. When Russia launched its invasion, approximately $300 billion of its funds were frozen in Western banks. $200 billion of this is located in Europe, with 80% of that European portion residing in one specific bank in Belgium. Belgium had legitimate concerns. If a future peace deal required Russia's money to be returned, they wanted assurance they would not be the sole party liable for that repayment. The EU's solution, now delayed. To address Belgian concerns, the EU was developing a mechanism. They would provide Ukraine with loans equivalent to the frozen funds. Ukraine would hold these loans against the banked assets. Russia would only be able to reclaim the frozen funds in the future if it agreed to pay war reparations to Ukraine. Since Russia is widely expected never to pay reparations, the EU would be legally safer, and technically never have to repay Russia. This viable plan was set for a final decision in December. How the peace plan destroys the solution. This viable plan is now likely delayed indefinitely, even if the peace proposal ultimately fails. This is because the new peace deal contains a provision stipulating that Russia only needs to pay $100 billion to Ukraine to reclaim the majority of its frozen assets. The mere existence of this clause makes European countries apprehensive about providing the money to Ukraine. They now fear that they might be legally required to repay Russia later, meaning the European taxpayers will have to pay it back. This prevailing worry ensures that Ukraine will struggle to obtain the essential funds needed for its defense. This problem will not go away, even if the peace plan dies quickly, delaying economic pressure and Russia's minimal concession. On top of the funding crisis, this plan also postpones pressure on the Russian economy. Only 2 weeks ago, President Trump was discussing a pending Senate bill that would grant him the authority to impose 500% tariffs on nations supporting Russia's war effort, such as China, India, Turkey, and Brazil. These significant financial sanctions are now delayed, giving Russia critical breathing room to continue its invasion. In return for all these advantages to Russia, hurting Ukraine's defense, delaying sanctions, what concrete concessions has Putin given? When a reporter inquired of a senior U.S. official about what Putin conceded to Steve Witkoff, the plan's architect, the official's response was essentially that Putin's concession was simply not trying to take the rest of Ukraine. Propaganda versus military reality. We must be clear. Even if Russia were to capture the entirety of currently contested cities like PCRs in the next few weeks, it does not mean Russia is anywhere close to taking over all of Ukraine. For perspective, over the last 3 years, Russia has secured less than 1% of Ukrainian territory, at the enormous cost of sacrificing more than 1 million men. Putin simply lacks the manpower and resources to achieve a full conquest of Ukraine. This is precisely why he heavily funds propaganda. He seeks to convince the global community that his army can defeat Ukraine. He hopes that if the world believes he can win, international support for Ukraine will cease, thereby directly benefiting Russian forces on the front lines. Pressure on Ukraine and the need for continued support. Regrettably, this tactic seems to be having temporary success, as the United States is currently pressuring Ukraine to accept the deal without amendments. Ukraine cannot comply. As they cannot surrender territory, Russia doesn't even control just to secure peace. President Zelensky commented that his country faces the risk of sacrificing either its partner or its dignity. There has been criticism implying that Zelensky may eventually be forced to accept it, or else the US might withdraw its support. Trump claimed he told Zelensky, "You don't have the cards," emphasizing that he inherited the war and felt a deal should have been finalized 1 or 2 years ago. The idea that Ukraine can simply continue fighting successfully without US aid is ill-advised. US intelligence plays a crucial role in everything Ukraine is doing, especially the strikes targeting refineries, power plants, and ports. Without this assistance, the war would become significantly more difficult for Ukrainian soldiers and citizens. Instead of letting the US pull out of the war, we should be applying more pressure on the current administration. The majority of US citizens, senators, and House representatives across the political spectrum support Ukraine. Since domestic politics heavily influences foreign policy, public pressure must be applied to the administration to ensure they continue providing necessary support. This means sharing information, contacting representatives, and discussing the issue on social media to ensure public opinion is clearly communicated.